All right, you're live on Facebook.
Hey, good morning, Facebook. This is Jim Blythe. Joining me, Captain Marc Liebman. What a great man, a great author, a SAR rescue pilot during Vietnam. And I got to tell you, you're in for a great show this morning. And I'll quit using great. We'll go to something else. So we're going to start here in just a second. This is your Veterans Impact Show. We're right with you now. Welcome to the Veterans Impact Show, where we continue the mission of highlighting veterans and service organizations who continue to serve our community and our nation. We're brought to you by Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Don't worry, retire happy. Welcome aboard. Good morning. Welcome aboard. I got to tell you, great Navy captain, SAR rescue pilot, tremendous author. I have enjoyed his book so much. I'd like to introduce you to Marc Liebman, Captain, U.S. Navy, retired. Marc, welcome aboard. You have been a great friend and a great inspiration to me, and we have enjoyed having you be a part of this. You're not only a tremendous author, but you're a great speaker. So we're going to get that out of the way right quick. If people want to know, how can I find Marc Liebman? You have a website. Tell us what that is real quick.
Sure. It's Marc Liebman. It's www.marcliebman.com. And you can find all my books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and God knows where else. They're available in ebook forms. Three of them are available as audiobooks. And of course, if you want signed copies, just send me an email through the contact Marc, and I'm happy to sign one and send it to you.
One of the things is I enjoyed reading your Cherubs and your Big Mother 40, which were books about SAR rescue in Vietnam. Wasn't about the fact that I was there, but it was about the development of the character. You have such a way of researching and developing those characters. Can you tell us a little bit about that and that inspiration?
Sure. So the main character in the, I call the Josh Heyman series, because I got three series of books out there. So Josh Heyman is a naval officer. The series starts in Vietnam. 7 books later, he's off the coast of North Korea as an 06, and he retires. So his career is sort of loosely based on mine. But also it's a composite of others. But what I did was I took people that I knew, and then I changed them into the character to fit the book. So, for example, I walk around, and every time I see a rescue air crewman or a rescue swimmer, as they're now known, or an Air Force paramedic, I walk up to them, shake their hand, and congratulate them as being the bravest people in the world. And the reason for that, I say that, is because forget combat. In the Navy, if you're a rescue swimmer, you're in the back of a helicopter, somebody goes down, the helicopter zips off 50, 100 miles from the ship or a ship, and the rescue swimmer looks down. The pilot typically is entangled in the shroud lines or is injured, can't get in his raft. And there you are, 10,000 miles from any place in 20,000 feet of water where there are things, animals, fish that would look at you as a nice meal. And you leap, these rescue air crewmen will leap readily into the water, spend 15, 20 minutes, an hour, whatever it takes to get the survivor out of his parachute and into a situation where he can hoist him in the helicopter. Meanwhile, we go off to the side, and they do this with the hopes and the trust and confidence that we're going to come back and find them. And what a lot of people don't realize is how difficult it is to find a human being in the ocean, particularly when all you can see is his helmet.
Do you have like a light or a smoke or something that
sometimes they have light. Well, sometimes they have light. Sometimes they have smokes. And it all makes it easier. But finding them initially is is the real problem. But even then, this stuff doesn't work. So anyway, coming back to the crewmen. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for these air crewmen, and I had 3 of them that I've kind of combined into 2. One was a young man who was an E4. And he came from a family in Minnesota. He was the youngest of 6 kids. And every time we'd be sitting there droning around and doing nothing, just going around in circles waiting for something to happen, he'd be in the back of the helicopter reading textbooks on biology and anatomy and stuff like that because he wanted to be a doctor.
Wow.
So he ultimately leaves the Navy, actually goes into what they call the NESEP program, which is a scholarship program, again, an ROTC scholarship. They go to school as an E5. They have to graduate next number of years. He goes to medical school. The Navy pays for that, becomes an orthopedic surgeon, and the rest is history. And then there's another air crewman who in the book is known as Vanderjack, and he's pretty much in every one of the 7 novels. He started out as an E4, and he was a kid from the wrong side of the tracks in New York City, and was given a choice in a courtroom. And this is the true part. I won't use his real name, but he was given a choice by a judge: Army, Navy, Air Force, or jail. And so the only recruiter, and this judge would bring recruiters into the courtroom, so if they picked one, there's a recruiter go off and yay verily. And so the only recruiter in the room was a Navy recruiter, and so he becomes an avionics technician. The real guy was an aviation metalsmith, but he becomes an aviation electronics technician, or excuse me, an electronics technician, becomes an rescue air crewman, and then ultimately, as the books develop, his career develops, and he's always there. And again, it's way of my trip. Providing tribute to the enlisted people, particularly those who support us who fly airplanes and helicopters, because without these young men, and I use the word, I should start to say kids, because typically they're 19, 20 years old, and if they do something wrong, you die. It's as simple as that.
Well, I got to tell you, I can relate to that because my last tour on the Oriskany was with HC-1, which was exactly what we did, was helicopter rescue. And I was not an air crewman. I had the opportunity to do that, but I really wanted to go back to college. And I thought, well, that's going to keep me, because I've got to do so much more training. Big mistake that I made, because I think I would have really enjoyed it. One of the big things was when you were talking about out there in 10,000 miles from nowhere and 20,000 feet of water. Well, we had an incident just off of the San Diego coast where the tail rotor drive shaft went in a training mission. So one of the things, it's not that you can't just find the guy, because sometimes you're pretty close or sometimes you can, but sometimes bad things go wrong to good aircraft. And there's other things that you and I have talked about with that hooky took that we had, was the clamshell doors. And if it rains out there, man, your instruments are gone.
Yep.
So there's so much to that is totally out of your control. And if you're in the water, and you're trying to get a guy out of the shroud lines, and you're trying to, and many times they're unconscious
or badly hurt.
And then there was a bunch of them, you're talking about going in the water with HC-1, there was HC-7. So if you went down in country, they went after you, and they were armored.
Well, yeah, armored is a loose term. We had some armor plate, we had a minigun, and we had a M60, and then we had the personal weapons. Unlike the Air Force, which sent an armada in to pick people up, the Navy sent one helicopter alone, and I like to say unafraid, but scared to death. But the combat side adds another dimension, and it adds a more fear because of the possibility of getting shot down. But the physics or the actual process of the rescue is the same. You just have to do it faster. And again, most guys, when they eject, they're trying to save the airplane, get it to a safe location, and the airplane may or may not be under control, or it may be on fire, or both. So quite often when they eject, the airplane's not straight and level.
Right.
Okay. And so as they come out of the airplane, they're going from riding an airplane going, let's say 250, 300 knots, because they've slowed it down to whatever, or worse, they're going out faster. And so the seat comes out of the airplane, their arms and legs flail, and dislocated shoulders or broken legs, broken arms, broken backs are all common.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they're landing in the trees, going down through the trees in a parachute is not a fun experience. And so this gets into another one of my favorite topics, is about a lot of the guys who probably are missing when we saw the chutes, we saw them go into the trees, but either they were injured or killed, or when they were injured or incapacitated, something, being an animal or a snake or whatever, finished it, or they just died of their wounds or their injuries. So the other common thing is internal injuries, and again, the swimmer doesn't know, or the rescue air crewman doesn't know really what's wrong until he's sitting there or swimming there next to the guy and looking at him. And yeah, you can talk on the radio. Yeah, he'll say he's hurt. But again, you don't know. And in some cases, backs are the hardest
Mm-hmm.
because you gotta figure out a way to put them on a backboard, which can be entertaining in the water or just on land. And then you have to get them up without you got them strapped to the backboard strapped to the or clipped to his harness and then clipped to the hoist. And then you got to get them up in the helicopter, which always is not as easy as it looks.
No, it's not. And my hat's off to it. There was a rescue crewman that would trained our rescue crewmen in my squadron, and I found out we all got called in, and they said he's leaving because he just got the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Who was that?
I can't remember the guy's name, but he actually went down in Hanoi and got a guy out, and he was shot like umpteen times. And of course, part of the problem was they didn't have enough gunpowder in their rounds, so the rounds were hitting him but not tearing him up. But he was hit a bunch of times, and he was a great friend.
You know what year this was?
You
remember?
Well, I was there. That was in 1970. So he was our trainer and leader, rescue crewman, and then was relieved in 1970. So whatever he did happened in the late 60s.
Okay, he was probably with the Clyde Lassen crew that got, and Clyde Lassen, who was the aircraft commander, got the Congressional Medal of Honor. So they literally could not. The pilot could not see them, and they couldn't see the pilot. So what Lassen did is he lands in a field, turns the lights on the helicopter, the white floodlights.
Oh, man.
In the middle of North Vietnam, and the air crewmen run out to get the pilot who's injured, and both of them got shot. They got in the airplane, and everybody get out, pilot, and 4 air crewmen in the helicopter. Anyway, so Lassen gets the Congressional Medal of Honor, which, by the way, is one of 2 given to naval aviators during Vietnam. The other one was given to Mike Stassen, who was flying a mission, SAM suppression mission, when he did his job, then went back into the target area to help somebody else and also finish the job. And then he took a SAM and unfortunately didn't make it. But anyway.
Well, Mark, let me go back a quick point that I would also like to make, because one of the things we're talking about combat and all that. But when you talked about within your story, the crewman going through the NESEP program and going to Naval ROTC, the flight surgeon that we had for my squadron, VA 163, was one of those young men.
What was his name?
I don't know. I wish I knew, but he basically came from a very troubled background and went into the Navy to get away from problems. Let's just
family
leave
problems.
Yeah. And basically did so well. He was a Navy corpsman.
Yep.
And he did so well that they sent him, and I believe they sent him to Duke. I'm not sure, but he went through medical school. And then what I heard was, and I don't have any way of verifying this, he went to Balboa Naval Hospital in San Diego to do like his internship
and residency.
Well, he decided, and he got a job working in the San Diego community hospitals, triage, ER, and all that.
Work, yeah.
And the guy became known as the #1 triage surgeon in the nation, in the Navy. And then he requested, because we had such a high casualty rate, and we had a Lieutenant Denny Earl that took a round through his leg and his foot and basically got the aircraft back aboard the Hancock. And it was a mess. I mean, he was bad shape. This doctor worked on him for hours. And Diane and I know Denny Earl. We saw Denny Earl a couple of years ago. You'd never know he'd been hurt. That guy was that good. And this is one of the things that I wanted to make a point about: the Navy's education, the Navy's opportunities for education is unbelievable.
Yeah. This is also a personal story. I have a step grandson who is enlisted in the Navy because he didn't want to go to college. He's now in IS-1. I have a grandson who is going to boot camp on August 10th.
All right. How great. Mark, when we come back, I want to get more into some of your books and some of your books that you're working on that we were talking about. So everybody, you got to stand by. This is an adventure series that's going to make a cliffhanger of a program for you. How about that? cliffhanger, jumping out of perfectly good helicopters, and trying to bridge the gap there. Okay, sorry. Hey, Chuck Wright couldn't be here with us today. He is involved with Marine Corps League in a program. I miss him dearly. He wishes he could be here, so he'll be back next week. This is Veterans Impact Show, and we want to say a special thank you to the AUN Network and the DBTV Network, and to my company, Fairway Independent Mortgage. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. Well, I don't need to reintroduce, because I think everybody knows, having watched our program, Marc Liebman, author, Navy, SAR rescue pilot, amazing man. Where do we want to go with this conversation now? It's been too much fun. You direct it. Where do you want to go?
Okay, so I want to talk about 2 books I'm about to redo the 2nd edition.
Okay.
So this is them. A little lower. Okay. Yeah. There we go. Anyway, the Flight of the Pawnee and Failure to Fire. They're books about counterterrorism. The hero's oddly enough, a Navy helicopter pilot who gets out of the Navy, goes to work as a contract pilot for the Central Intelligence Agency, and so that's the main character's name is Derek Almer. And so what I did when I started creating this series was I wanted to focus. It's going to be a short series, 3, maybe 4 books, about threats to the United States from a terrorist perspective that nobody likes to talk about. So Flight of the Pawnee is out there. You can buy it now, but in the process of getting it, like I said, republished as a self-published novel, that's a story unto itself that I don't want to get into. But and I'm changing it a little bit, mainly to update it and also to fix some of the problems from the publishing perspective that were in the book. And so it deals with Al-Qaeda sending somebody to the United States, actually to North Texas, to kill at least 10,000 Americans in one attack. And he figures out how. The threat is using chemical weapons, in this case, sarin. I won't tell you a whole about the plot, but the threat is real. You can make chemical weapons relatively easily. The problem with chemical weapons is employment, because they're dependent on a lot of things: atmospherics, temperature, humidity, wind, but they're also as dangerous to the employer as to the victim. Mm-hmm. So if you screw up the deployment, it kills you as well as everybody else.
Little blowback's a bad deal.
Yeah, little blowback's a bad deal. So that's Flight of the Pawnee. And then Failure to Fire is a different threat, also driven by Al-Qaeda. Same character, takes place pretty much in the eastern United States. But what Al-Qaeda wants to do is shut down the U.S. air transportation system using manpads, which are manned portable air defense systems, things like Stinger, Starstreak, the Soviets at the time, SA-14s, SA-16s, SA-24s, and the stuff you see in the news reports in the Ukraine, shooting down helicopters and airplanes. And in fact, every time I see one shooting down a helicopter, I cringe. It's hard for me to watch.
Yeah.
So the reason this book is sort of interesting now is when it was originally published in January 2000, so 2 years ago, it'd be 2021. I based the plot on a report I found that I found that the FAA did with Federal Express and DHL about putting countermeasure systems on their cargo aircraft, because by this time FedEx and DHL had several shot at and hit. Thankfully, none of them crashed, or at least killed people. Were shot at by these missiles, and
in foreign countries.
Correct.
Okay.
Not in the United States. Not in the United States. Correct. And in fact, when you read the study, I actually looked. It's in Wikipedia now. There are like 60 of these attacks before 2017 when I started, or 2019 rather, when I started writing the book. So there's been more since. But my point is these manpads are really simple. They're all over the world. The Soviets, the Chinese, and the U.S. and the Brits and the French have produced thousands of these weapons. We gave a bunch to the Fedayeen and during the Afghan war against the Soviets. And a lot of these are out there. The difference between the U.S. or NATO-made manpads and those are the Soviets and Chinese, is we put in the software a kill date. In other words, after such and such a date, the weapon can't be fired. It won't function. You have to go in and change the software, which is hard coded into the weapon. So anyway, so the bad guys get hold of these things and they smuggle them into the United States and want to shut down the U.S. air transportation system. The point about this is that 2 weeks after the book came out in January 2021, FedEx announces to the world that it has gotten approval from the FAA to equip all its airplanes in its entire fleet, starting with those deployed in certain parts of the world, with these directed infrared countermeasure systems. So in the book, there's a synopsis in the back of the study. I've got a redacted version of
Wow.
it. But the point about this is that I was a business consultant for years, and I flew 150, 200,000 miles a year getting on an airliner, and you are totally defenseless. The only airlines in the world that have these countermeasure systems are Israeli based. They're required. And the cost to install it is relatively inexpensive. It's about 30 cents per this is $2,002.
That's a fascinating discussion to talk about. How do we protect ourselves? How do we also support the kind of protection we need? So we're going to be right back. Veterans Impact Show is here for you with Marc Liebman. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation. I'm having too much fun. Marc and I were in the Navy about the same time. He was a SAR rescue pilot. My last tour was with the SAR rescue. And yet I have really, really enjoyed his books and his lectures. Again, go to marcliebman.com. Okay. And by the way, my wife helps him out with that information and his Facebook and et cetera as well. So you can link to marcliebman.com. You want to really get to know this guy, though, get to know his books. They're fantastic. And we've talked about your contemporary books, which I consider Big Mother 40 and Cherub's Vietnam era. And then now you were talking about Flight of the Pawnee. I got started on that book and I had to put it down. I was like, whoa. But one of the books I got into that really enjoyed was your Age of Sail. And the way you did the research and all that and developed the characters.
Yeah. So my publisher, God, it's been about 4 years ago, at lunch one day, sits down and we're having actually it was a dinner with my wife, my publisher, and the editor. And he says to me, he says, "You're a fan of Horatio Hornblower and Aubrey Martin and Richard Bolitho. Those are all series about the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. Why don't you? They're really popular. We've just gotten the rights to the Hornblower series from the family, from Forster's family, and we think he could write a really good series." And he says, "What do you think?" And I said, "Sure." It took me about longer to say that than what it actually the thought process. So he says to me, he says, "How long would you think you have the first manuscript?" And I said 6 months, which is typically about what I do. And if you look at this chart that's up there, as you can see, those are all my books, all 12 of them, I think. And you can see the rough timeline. And that's the most common question I get is, how long does it take to write a book? And the point about this slide is the research goes right up to the point it's actually released. But you can see over there on the right, the outlier, which is a Raider of the Scots Coast. And so I said 6 months, and 15 months later, I delivered the first manuscript.
and that is a great book. I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
It was became an Amazon bestseller. The third book in the series, Death of the Lady, is out. There's another one called Carronade. I'm gonna hopefully dump Last Battles into the publishing process sometime the summer, but I'm under contract for 6. He wants me to write more, and we'll see. So, excuse me, I'm under contract for 7, and he wants me to write more. Anyway, the research of this, and my editor says to me, says, what you've probably done as you do this is you probably earned a PhD in early American history. Now, I write a blog on my website, and you can find it all kinds of places about this period from 1770 roughly to ultimately 1816, and I'm now in the early 1800s. And it's about stuff that you don't read about in history books, but it's all about significant things. And one of the things I learned, and this is just fascinating, is that the American Revolution is really the beginning of the emancipation of the American woman, because of the population of the colonies. Those are what we would call rebels. The Brits called rebels. We would call patriots. And into one time, roughly 40,000 males were either in the Continental Navy or the Continental Army. I mean, yeah, Continental Army or Continental Navy. So, or a militia, but they're away from home. So then the question now becomes: is who's running the store, so to speak? Who's running the farm? Well, it's obviously the wives. And so you start seeing women wanting to expand their role out of what the traditional German Kirchküche and Kinder, which is Kinder, children, kitchen, and church. And the other thing that the American Revolution did was enable people to make choices about their careers. So if you were growing up in Germany, for example, or growing up in France, you were stuck in whatever class of society you were born into. And the same thing was true in England. And it was difficult to rise out of that. But if you came to America or came to the 13 colonies, you could buy land, something most people couldn't do in Europe, and you could do what you wanted to do. So
you could make something of yourself.
Correct. That was different than the poverty or whatever you were born into. So what you start to see is women wanting to become lawyers, doctors, business people, professors. So what I did in the series is there's actually 4 women who are pursuing these professions. So if you wanted to be a medical doctor, you couldn't do that because you were not. There was a medical school in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania, but you couldn't get in as a woman. You couldn't go to an English or German medical school because you're a woman. So how do you become a doctor? Well, you have to apprentice yourself to a doctor, and then you can get the title physician because you need to have a degree to be an MD. The same thing with if you wanted to be a lawyer. So I have a character in this book who apprentices herself to a law firm and ultimately passes the South Carolina bar. And then I have others like that. But you start to see this. Now, to be really honest, the books are probably 10 years ahead of when it really started to happen, because it really started to happen around 1805, 1806, because that's when women started to get accepted to schools, advanced colleges and universities on a very limited basis. But by the 1820s and 1830s, it started to take.
Well, wasn't that also the dawn of really the Industrial Revolution, where you started seeing rail, and all of a sudden the country was coming together with rail lines? World was coming together. England developed
yes, Jim,
rails.
You're about 20 years ahead of the story, but yes. And so if you read my blog this Sunday, you talk about the event that changed world transportation forever. And that was, yes, there were steam engines, but when smoke billowed out of this ship in New York on the Hudson River, and this paddle wheel steamer backed away from the pier on the Hudson River side on Manhattan and steamed in 32 hours to Albany, New York, and then back again. Robert Fulton changed sea transportation because it was a steamboat. It was not required to sail, which meant you were no longer dependent on winds. Now, it took a few years before you could go any place because the coal consumption, and it took the development of what we call a screw propeller, a practical one, that took a few more years. But coal was a big limiting factor, and about transiting the Atlantic, because it took a tremendous amount of coal, and that plus the fact the ships were, I use the word dirty because the coal dust is everywhere. If you ever been around coal-powered stuff, it's just everywhere. And it's also, as we learned with the USS Maine, it's explosive. But the fact is that you have women starting to do this, and then the Industrial Revolution starts. By the way, the Industrial Revolution didn't start in England. It started with a guy by the name you've probably heard of called Eli Whitney, and it's not about the cotton gin. What Eli Whitney figured out how to do was make interchangeable parts for firearms for the U.S. military.
That was one of the big things, because every gun was made by a gunsmith, but they were all made individually. Matter of fact, many of your first cars were done the same way. Then he standardized things so that you could pick up this weapon, and interchange parts if you broke something.
Yeah. So what they were made of before was with patterns, and the patterns are made out of wood. Okay. And so they would make molds. Okay. So gunsmith A would make the mold for a pattern for the lock, for a flintlock, which is or the hammer, let's call it that. That it's easy to imagine what it is. Well, his version of that hammer is different than your version or my version, and therefore they're not the same. So what Whitney did was two things. One is he standardized the designs. Two, he created drawings that enabled somebody else to convert his drawings to a pattern or to a mold. But he actually made a factory where he can spit these things out relatively fast, again, using steam power. So what steam power did is it enabled you to set up a factory that wasn't dependent on water power, because at that time you need a fast flowing river to turn a paddle wheel, which would then turn things. Or you use wind in Holland to use windmills to turn things like to grind wheat and corn into flour. So what you see in the beginning of the American Revolution, or not, the end of the American Revolution, is one, the advent of land, which attracted people. And I won't get into the growth that happened in that period. That's a whole nother conversation. But Americans, now that we're an independent country, we're free to innovate and do things, and they didn't have to deal with all the societies and I hate to use this word because my British friends will kill me, but it's all the peerages and the classes. And if you weren't born to the right family, you couldn't do this. In America, basically, if you had a good idea and you could make it work and you could sell it and sell it more than once, you were in business, and there was relatively no restrictions upon you.
This was an age also of enlightenment, because you're talking about women who wanted to get into these professions. You mentioned medical and legal. There were other professions that women got into, for instance, managing the store.
Yep.
Running farms. There were many women that were actually running, the farm and getting this out.
Yeah. So what happened was, families in those days were much larger than they are today. A family having 6 or 7 children was not uncommon. Why? Well, one is because a disease generally killed 1 or 2 before they got to become adults. But the other thing is you needed labor for the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say you're in Western North Carolina and dad dies, accident, Indian, disease, whatever. Okay. Who's going to run the farm? Mom's got to run the farm with the children. And so she has to not only do the physical labor, and the kids have to do the physical labor, but she's got to do the business side, which is selling the any extra food that they generate to generate money to buy stuff, tools, implements. So that turns her into a businesswoman. And again, everybody talks about Betsy Ross, and this is one of my favorite things. She was a seamstress. Why? Because her husband ran a store. She was the factory.
Yeah.
Okay. Or she was the factory labor, I should say. When I say she, there was other women involved. But my point about all this is that what you started to see in the 1790s and early 18, in fact, during the American Revolution, but it started accelerating in the 1790s, was women taking a bigger and bigger role in society, despite the fact that the laws, for example, didn't recognize them, despite the fact that schools didn't allow them to enroll. I'm talking about colleges and universities. There's this school in Charleston, South Carolina called the College of Charleston. It's one of the first schools in the country that admitted women. And so one of the characters in this book is a woman by the name of Miriam Bildesheim. And she's modeled after a woman by the name of Abigail Minnis, who's considered one of the first ladies of Georgia. She arrives in the United States with 2 daughters in 1720 something. And her husband dies after siring 5 more daughters. So she's an adult. She has 5 or 7 children.
Wow.
All girls. So back in those days, they didn't have bathrooms, but you can just imagine what that would have been like in a house.
Petticoat Junction.
So,
really.
And when she dies in 1796 and she's 96 years old, her husband left her with a gunsmithing store or a gunsmithing shop. She now has 2 inns, a general store, and 100,000 acres of land.
Mm.
Okay. So Abigail Minnis is a unique character. The Brits hate her because she was feeding the rebels in South Carolina and Georgia, and they arrested her. They treated her badly. And she there's some very famous quotes from her, which I use in one of my books, is, you've already lost the one of them. She tells a British general, Cornwallis, as a matter of fact, that you've already lost the war when you're making war on women and children. She's talking about her, but the message is larger. But Abigail Minnis is a phenomenal story about how a woman comes to the United States, emigrates from Prussia, arrives, her husband sets up a gun shop, he dies from disease. She's left with 7 children, and away she goes. And by the way, she never learned to write English or read English. She could
Wow.
she could speak, she could sort of read, but she did everything in a kind of a what my friends used to call Katzenjammer English. It's kind of a combination of English and German. She kept diaries. She had inns. And her daughters essentially did this. And the other things, by the way, is she was an opponent of slavery. So when she'd buy land from plantations, she would, once she took possession, she'd free the slaves. So in the book, there's this thing called a collective. It's Miriam Bildesheim's collective. It's collective in the Israeli version. So what she does is she buys the farms, and then she frees the slaves, gives them shares in the business, and says, "Okay, you're free to now work the farm. I'm going to buy your product, whatever you grow. You get to keep the profit. I'm going to take, or when I sell it, I'm going to take a slice off the top, but you get the bulk of the money." So what she's doing is she's turning former slaves into farmers, entrepreneurs. And this is one of the other things that Abigail Minnis did. So I took that research, so to speak, and I found and created this character called Miriam Bildesheim. So the main character in this series is a young man by the name of Jaco Jacinto, to use the Spanish pronunciation, and his family came to the United States from Spain via the Netherlands and settled in Charleston. The other main character is a British naval officer.
Yeah, I enjoyed the interplay that you developed within that, but I didn't know, because I remember reading about that in Jaco and all, and how much I enjoyed that. You want to really enjoy a great book, I got to tell you, go to his Age of Sail. What is the name? There's
three books out there right now. One's Raider of the Scottish Coast. It's the first. The second's Carronade, and the third is Death of the Lady. The fourth one will be out sometime later this year. It's going to be called Last Battles.
How fun. All right. You want to go to markliebman.com, find out more about him. If you want to have a great speaker to your organization, Marc is here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I bet I can get him to travel to other places to do that. He's a great speaker and very animated, because I'm enjoying what we're doing today. So please stay with us. And thank you again to Fairway. My MLS number is 311548, and theirs is 2289. We're thankful for them. We're thankful to be here. Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show. And thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Okay. Now, let's continue this great conversation. I'm having a great day with Marc Liebman. Now, to wrap up this conversation and bring this program back into the dock, I want to continue the conversation we were having a minute ago, which was, to me, very interesting about your development of a character, the women that you were developing. So, Marc, continue that.
Okay, so one of the things that sets the Age of Sail series apart is the two main characters. One starts as a Continental Navy midshipman, and the other is a character by the name of Darren Smythe, who's starts off as a Royal Navy midshipman. So they start as mortal enemies, and then they meet when Jacinto captures Smith. They become good friends because they come from similar backgrounds. But the series has their careers at sometimes being mortal enemies, then they become friends again, depending on what period it is. So the series starts in 1776. It's taken me 3-4 books to get to the end of the American Revolution, which, by the way, lasted 8 years. And then we're going to do something about the Quasi War, and then impressment. And then the last book I have envisioned right now, it's during the Barbary Wars. But I said, my publisher, because of success on the marketplace, is asking me to write more. So, but
if you're good, everybody wants more. Hey, let me tell you, that's a compliment. Because if you weren't good, ain't nobody be talking to you except me.
Yep. Thank you. Anyway, by the way, Jim, thanks for your kind words. I love doing these shows. They're fun. And but anyway, so that's the Age of Sail series. It's, like I said, it's been an education. And if you want to read about that period of American history, read my blog. It's on my website. It's on about 5 or 6 different places, and it's you can get to it through my Facebook page, courtesy of Diane, which is Jim's wife, who without her, my Facebook page would be a mess.
Let me just, you talking about American history, but more than that, you're talking about exciting characters. These two men you're talking about, who were mortal enemies, then to become friends, and throughout this entire interplay that goes on in your book that I've enjoyed so much, The Raiders of the Scottish Coast. It's not only history I never knew about, but it's character development, it's action, it's adventure, but it's so different from anything you can think of other than the old Horatio Hornblower, the old wonderful movies that we saw as very young children. This is a great thing, and it's fun. I mean, it's purely fun. I wouldn't say to somebody, hey, you want to be bored to death and hear about American history? No, you want to really enjoy something and get a big charge out of it. This is the place to go. And so I want to thank you so much. And thank you again for inspiring us and talking about and showing your timeline. Again, we want people to go to marcliebman.com. You're spelled with a C, M-A-R-C. Yeah,
Yes,
thank you,
correct.
Diane. Because I've been doing it for so long. And Marc, I want to say, man, we're holding your wife in prayers because she's got to have some medical issues taken care of. And I think that's really important. And that we take care of everybody right now. We've got so many people who are hurting. So I would like to close with a prayer. So if you'll join me, Lord God of the universe, we are so thankful for you and putting a hedge of protection around all of our active duty military, our active duty first responders, those who come when the need is greatest, those who are there thinking about us and not about themselves. And we thank you for protecting them, and we thank you for them, and we thank you for the young men and women who are signing up today to be part of the greatest organizations in the world, the American military. There's so many opportunities for them, and we thank you. And we thank you for our veterans who are doing so many wonderful things, such as what Marc Liebman's doing with his books, what men like Admiral Pat Walsh is doing with his Cristo Rey School. There are so many things. We want people to know what veterans are doing in the community. And so we say, thank you, God. We thank you with all of our heart. And we say, dear God, help us bring this nation back together. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Amen.
Marc, this has been a blast. I've enjoyed it so much.
Are we off the air?
No, can we come back here in a few weeks to talk about your next book? Because Diane's not letting me read it, and I wanted to read it. She edited it and helped. I think it's going to be exciting. And then I want to maybe see if we can't set up a roundtable somewhere, sometime, for a breakfast or a lunch that you get to speak one-on-one with a lot of people who'd like to know more about being an author and what it takes, as well as many of the teachers in talking with Pat Walsh. His Cristo Rey School is amazing that they're doing here in
Here's
Dallas.
the answer to that question. I'm in. Just tell me when and where.
All right. I'm going to be.
And by the way, I'd love to go talk to Admiral Walsh's kids at their school about being an author. Be a hoot. I've done it with other schools. And by the way, I do writers panels at.
Let's do that. So thank you so much for being part of the Veterans Impact Show. Chuck, we're sorry you're not with us. We're here for you. Come back next week. We've got an exciting program for you. This is Jim Blythe saying thank you. Veterans Impact Show.